The word yet is important, because sooner or later it will be too late. If you haven't thought about it now, then you've jolly got to start thinking about it, because believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I've only mentioned 2 examples of raw materials which South Africa has a virtual monopoly of. Platinum and chrome are the 2 essential ones, but you've got other ones like vanadium, without which you can't make jet engines. Palladium, diamonds and gold, of course, and a whole catalogue of other raw materials that you won't get from South Africa if South Africa goes the Marxist way. It's the indirect means of war, and the Russians have always used this indirect means of fighting war at every level. They've used the surrogates like the Cubans to fight their war in Angola, and when they have won South Africa by indirect means, by which I mean in this case they're using the unfortunate blacks and Indians and Asians and coloureds as their pawns, because the damage that is being done in South Africa, the terror that is being done there inside the black townships, is being done by black to black. This is part of the cynicism of the whole communist operation. They proclaim to the world that they are the supporters of the coloureds and the underdogs, but in fact it is the black populations who are suffering from the communist invasion. Since the Black Power movement began in 1970, 5 million blacks have already been killed on the African continent, and one Marxist government after another had been established, and the only one which survives is down in South Africa. And thank God for that, because if South Africa goes, the whole of the Western world can say good night, gute Nacht, goodbye, farewell, adieu. The Western world is indefensible. All that's going on in Reykjavik, in Helsinki, in Geneva for the last 30 or 40 years, the talk about SDI, Star Wars, non-proliferation pacts, all this talk about the nuclear missiles and agreements and inspection and the rest of it is all a big red herring designed to distract us from the fact that World War III has begun already some time ago. You don't need to know when it began. What matters for us is when it ends, because if it ends badly for us all and not just for the South Africans. Those of you who are waiting for World War III to begin, imagining that you will recognize the beginning of World War III when bombers fly overhead with their bomb doors opening, or mushroom clouds on the horizon, all these old-fashioned notions of how wars are fought today, you are not aware of the fact that wars are never fought like the wars before. Generals at the beginning of World War II, particularly the French generals, thought that it would begin with trench warfare like World War I, and that's the mistake we're making today. World War III is already being fought down in South Africa, and thank God we've got these 5 millions that we can rely on. And I know it because I've gone and spoken to them. I've looked them in the eye. I've looked these people in the eye and I've spoken to them and I've said, for God's sake, hold on. I'm going to come back every 6 months now, from now until this particular crisis has passed, to South Africa to encourage you. I'm going back to South Africa next March to an even bigger tour. This time 50 or 60 cities. I shall probably speak to 500,000 South Africans, and I shall tell them the one message from coast to coast and from frontier down to the tip, down to the Cape of Good Hope. I shall tell them the same thing. South Africa, it is time to fight back. And of course, if they fight back, then we shall see what the Mr. Mulroneys and the Mr. Clarks and the President Reagans and his Secretaries of State like Chester Crocker and Henry Kissinger shall say then. Because when the fight-back moment comes, then you will realize how dependent you are on the South Africans. And I hope to God that time comes sooner or later. Because if it comes too late, then the Russians, the communists, will have succeeded. I've attended the meetings of the South African Communist Party in England. I've got in there and I've sat in and I've listened to them talking about their secret plans for seizing power in South Africa. And let me tell you this, they are duping the blacks in South Africa. The South African Communist Party, headed by a greasy Lithuanian Jew called Joe Slovo, born in Russia, a KGB colonel, a British citizen by permission of Mrs. Thatcher, operating his terror campaign from North London, from Euston Road in North London, directing the terrorist organisation Umkhonto weSizwe, which is making the fire bombings and the necklacings in the black townships, with Mrs. Thatcher's permission from North London, along with Dennis Goldberg, this strange man who's only recently been here in South Africa. Dennis Goldberg, who was imprisoned with Nelson Mandela as a convicted terrorist for life, because he was found with Nelson Mandela, and on their possession in their hands were the actual plans for the manufacture of 210,000 hand grenades and 48,000 landmines, which is why they were sentenced to life imprisonment. These two arch-communists and murderers. Dennis Goldberg was foolishly released by the South African government last January because he gave his Boy Scouts word of honor that he wouldn't do it again, and he wouldn't commit any further acts of terrorism, and he fled to Israel, where he told horrified Israeli audiences that he intended to start doing the whole terror and murder campaign all over again, and it was the civilians' fault if they got in the way of the bullets and got killed themselves, his precise words. And now he's operating from London, and occasionally he comes here to Canada, where he speaks by permission of your television corporations like CBC. I saw him on the television being interviewed oh so politely nicely by such a genteel interviewer who asked him all these questions. And if you look in the newspapers, you'll see he's described as Dennis Goldberg, civil rights activist. What about the civil rights of the blacks who are being necklaced and killed in the black townships of South Africa by courtesy of his organization, Umkhonto we Sizwe? This is Dennis Goldberg. It is time that the Western governments ganged up on these gangsters and murderers and said, Mrs. Thatcher should to Joe Slover, get out, carry out your operations from behind the Iron Curtain where you belong, where you get your literature produced and manufactured. Dennis Goldberg should be refused admission to South Africa along with all the other murderers who had the blood of innocent citizens on their hands. Tim the Gubani, who went to California only last October to explain why they're carrying out the necklacings and tire burnings. Let me explain what a necklacing is. The black communists, the young lions as they're called down there, the black communists who've been infiltrated by the African National Congress, the members of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, spearhead of a nation in Zulu, Umkhonto we Sizwe, they get hold of somebody in the black townships they don't like, a traffic warden or a rent collector or some other figure, symbol of authority. They take him round the back, they cut off his hands with machetes, they drop a tire, a rubber tire, over his head, they soak him in diesel fuel and set him on fire, and he burns alive. They char him, as they say themselves. We char them into a despicable mess so that nobody in their wildest dreams thinks of ever working for the government, even in the black townships again. This is the cynical, cruel, unchristian way that the African National Congress is operating. And if the media of North America want to find some other reason why they should in fact be attacking the African National Congress, let me say that nowhere have I found such vitriolic anti-Semitism, such outpourings of anti-Zionist hatred as in the pages of the African National Congress, which is operating against South Africa, and yet you don't see that referred to anywhere in the North American media, and certainly not here in Canada. Because the truth, of course, is always given a different sheen. And if there's one thing that characterizes politicians here in the West, as opposed to those who are operating on the other side of the Iron Curtain, is something that Adolf Hitler said in admiration of Joseph Stalin, because Hitler did admire Stalin. I know this from Hitler's staff. They told me that the boss, or AH, or the chief as they called him, had the highest private admiration of Stalin and the way that he had lifted his people up out of the morass. And if there's one thing that characterized Stalin is what Hitler said about him. That man thinks in centuries. The Russians think in terms of centuries. And can you, ladies and gentlemen, think of one single politician here in Canada or on the entire North American continent who thinks in terms of centuries? They don't. They think in terms of one riding or one constituency to the next, from one election to the next, from one pay packet to the next, from one scandal, Billy Joe, whatever it is, Mr. Turner, whatever the scandal is in whichever country it is, whatever little tidbit the newspapers feed to them, from one television program, from one Dallas or one dynasty to the next. That's all your population is trained to think. You cannot think in terms of decades, let alone in terms of centuries. Is there one statesman in the entire Western world who thinks ahead beyond the next 10 or 20 years? None of them do. In Britain, the oil is going to run out in 20 years, but nobody's thinking about that disaster that's going to come now. But the Russians think in terms of centuries, and they don't mind how many blacks they kill in Africa in order to get their way. And so they are being patient. They've been trying since 1922, since the Communist Party was founded in July 1921, in fact, in South Africa, to gain their way. They're the white hand inside the black glove of the African National Congress. They've been trying ever since then, and occasionally they've come close to success, because South Africa holds the platinum key to world revolution. I've told you. And so they keep trying, they keep pushing. Every 8 or 9 or 10 years, there's a crisis in South Africa, and the whole of the Western media kicks in. They all join in. And if you wonder why, then I offer you a solution, ladies and gentlemen. The media, the journalists, the television commentators, the politicians, they are all the people that I describe as the intellectual Italians of the world. The intellectual Italians. Let me explain. Hitler once said, I think it was just after Pearl Harbor, he said, we can't lose the war now. We've got an ally, meaning the Japanese, who haven't ever been defeated in 3,000 years. He said, of course, we've got another ally, the Italians, who've been repeatedly defeated, but they've always managed to end up on the right side at the end. And he was right. Of course, the Italians changed sides in 1940. In fact, I think it was Napoleon who said, the Italians have never yet managed to end a war on the same side that they started it. Except for one occasion when they changed sides twice. One occasion when they changed sides twice, they ended up on the same side. I mention that because I've coined this phrase of the intellectual Italians. These are the gentlemen in the media here in North America and in Britain too, the journalists, the commentators, the reviewers, whatever they are, the politicians too. They've got this kind of unspoken notion that perhaps, given the weight of propaganda, the enemy may win. So even though they don't want to show it, they've got one leg in the enemy camp, just like the Italians in 1943 and in all the other wars they fought. They've got one leg in the enemy camp, and it's a very ungainly stance to try and maneuver freely while that leg's pinned down in the enemy camp. I've spoken to the journalists in the BBC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation and elsewhere, and they've admitted it. They've grinned foolishly when I said, what do you expect to do when the ANC takes power here in Pretoria? And they grinned foolishly. And I say, I know why you're grinning. You don't want to admit it, but you think you're going to keep your job. Well, look northwards. Look to Zimbabwe or the other British Rhodesias. Look to all the countries where the Marxists have taken power. How many of you intellectual Italians have managed to hold on to your jobs? The answer is none of you. Most of you are floating face downwards in the river. That's what happens to you in a black African, in black power state. And of course they don't want to accept it because they're busy doing the other ungainly dance, which is a feature of the of the intellectual Italians, walking with one leg on each side of the fence, like this. And it's a very ungainly walk, depending on how high that fence is. Why can't, I've said this in Pretoria, why doesn't your Minister of Information fight back using the immense propaganda possibilities that you have? Why don't they say that the outside world is making the wrong comparisons? Why don't they say, as I say all over the Northern Hemisphere, black power, good, in theory, in practice, how are you going to do it? Which tribe do you have in mind for power in Pretoria? Which tribe? In Africa, in the whole of Africa, you've got 2,000 different black tribes, 2,001 tribes if you include the white tribe, right? Which, in South Africa, you've got 12 tribes. So which tribe are you going to give the power to in Pretoria when the Black Revolution comes? The Xhosas, the Zulus, the Tswanas, the Sothos, the Ovambos, the Hereros, you've got a dozen tribes, and not one of them can stand the other. So if you give it to the Xhosa, and the African National Congress is largely Xhosa, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Alfred Nzo, they're all Xhosas. Bishop Tutu's a Xhosa too. Bishop Tutu, he's a Xhosa as well, except that he comes from the bottom left-hand corner of the Xhosas, right? I would call it the Simon Wiesenthal corner of the Xhosas. He is in a corner of the Xhosa tribe that no self-respecting Xhosa, let alone a Zulu, would ever take orders from. You've got to know this, but of course this is the kind of intricacy of the tribal setup in South Africa that you are not being told by your media. You're just being told the rather kind of Orwellian equivalent of 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. Black is good, white is bad. And anybody who says it the other way around is a racist. This is the puzzling thing. Well, I say that the South African government, and indeed we ourselves should say, the correct comparison is not between the standard level of the blacks in South Africa and the standard level of the whites, although there is an imbalance. The correct comparison is to say to the blacks in South Africa, do you want to live on as you are now, or do you want to go even further down and live like the blacks in Mozambique, or the blacks in the Belgian Congo, in the Zaire, in Zimbabwe, and in Zambia? This is the way it has to be put, and it's so obvious. Everywhere the Marxists have taken power, the blacks are suffering. I'll give you one example. The Belgian Congo, which is now called Zaire, the life expectancy in that country is now an average of less than 40 years. 20 years ago, when the whites were still in power in the Belgian Congo, they were the richest and one of the best looked after, one of the healthiest of the African nations. It slumped. The same in Mozambique. 250,000 white Portuguese have fled. Mozambique is now an economic shambles. And it's the same. I can give you an example here, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll bear with me a few more minutes. Out of the files of Idi Amin comes this document. A friend of mine went into Idi Amin's office on the day that he was overthrown and picked it up off his desk along with a box of medals. Idi Amin's medals, I've got them all in my office in London now. And whenever I feel low in spirits, occasionally I put on some of Idi Amin's medals and I parade before a mirror. Poor old Idi, he hasn't got these medals, I have. He hasn't got this document either, I have. It's Idi Amin's personal inquiry, Ugandan airfield at Entebbe, to rescue some Palestinian-held hostages from an Air France Airbus. A gallant operation, magnificent moves have been made by Hollywood about this Israeli operation, and here's Idi Amin's court of inquiry into what happened. A British government-style court of inquiry held with full majesty, pomp and panoply. Questions and answers from Lieutenant Fulgencio Bayegaruba, second in command of B Company on the airfield at Entebbe that night. You had troops under your control. Why did you hide? I didn't hide, I only took cover. What orders did you give as an army officer? All my troops ran away. I couldn't give orders to anybody. You ran all the way to Katabi, I understand. Whom do you think was in control of the troops? There was nobody to command because all my troops ran away. Now, the next officer who gives evidence is Lieutenant Raphael Osacha. I mean, you could write a book based just on this, or Idi Amin could, but of course he can't because I've got it. The whole report is 400 pages long. I just brought along a few pages of it because I had to land in Uganda on the way up to South Africa. Statement by Lieutenant Raphael Osacha of State Research. Now, you remember what state research is in a black power state? It's nothing to do with laboratories and stopwatches and thermometers. State research is the Gestapo. It's the Terror, Torture and Investigation Unit, and this is the lieutenant who's in charge of the Gestapo unit, the state research, on the airfield at Entebbe on that memorable historic night. He says, at the time shooting broke out, I was down in the basement torturing a suspect. I ran out, and on reaching the ticket sales counter, I was halted by an Israeli soldier. I refused, pointing my pistol at him. He ducked and take cover. At this point, his heroism gave out. I ran upstairs and I hid in a lady's toilet. Later, somebody come and look at the door of this toilet. I shot at him through the door. But unluckily, this was not an enemy. This person went and reported that an Israeli was hiding in the lady's toilet. This is when his troubles begin. His troubles begin. Anyway, following morning, the planes have all taken off. At what time did you come out of the toilet? At dawn, when the Israelis had already left. So he's okay. They had a Jeep on the airfield with a 106mm gun mounted on it. Now, of course, that could have done quite a lot of damage to those 3 jumbo jets if it had got close enough, or even from a range of half a mile, probably. But it never occurred to the man in charge to put a few rounds into those Israeli planes. If I can find it. What did you do? I took over. Well, I think it's probably I took cover. I think it's till morning? Yes. Was there any firing in that position? No. Did anybody pass by the position you were in? No. Who woke you? I was awake all night. And then the final question is put to the colonel in charge of airfield defense. I mean, obviously there's a lot more I could read out if we had time. The colonel in charge of airfield defense, black power. I mean, I read this document out to South African Defence Forces, to Southwest African Territorial Forces, who are the same thing. They wear a different uniform. South African Army in Windhoek, and also the ones who are fighting in Angola and in Mozambique. I read this out. I read it out to brigadiers, colonels, police officers, security officers. You can imagine the reception it got. And I said, when you hear something like this, doesn't it make you positively itch to go to certain places and do things in a certain way? What weakness on our part? The colonel in charge has asked us, what weakness on our part enabled the Israelis to successfully raid Entebbe? This is the important question. The answer is as follows. Their people were here. We didn't know they were coming. They surprised us, and they used force in rescuing the hostages. If the Israelis had informed us they were coming, they would have found us ready. No, ladies and gentlemen. I read this out purely as an example of how weak the enemy really are. And of course, this is what the Marxists know too, because if black power takes over in South Africa, they will be swept aside in due course by the Marxist regime about which we are all really concerned. And if the Marxists take over South Africa, the whole of the free world can, as I say good night, because you cannot then defend the free world. The planes will be grounded, the radar won't work, you can't make the gasoline, you won't get the steel. There's no possibility of fighting. The war will be over before we've even had a chance of fighting it, before we even had a chance of putting up a fight. And of course, it is no good pointing to the graves of Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Clark and saying, as I say now about Winston Churchill, these were the villains who let down the side for their own personal opportunism and advancement. These were the intellectual Italians who betrayed the entire free world. What we have to realize is what the position is now. The entire free world, 1 billion people, depends on 5 million Afrikaners and Englishmen who are holding the line in Africa despite everything, the vitriol that we are pouring on them. And so I say to you, as I say to them, going around South Africa, look around and realize that you cannot be isolated, that you are not alone, that there are intelligent faces and people who've come individually to come and hear me tonight, and I've told you the facts, and I've told you to be on guard, to accept that any organization or body, any association, any person who tells you something which, in the depth of your own mind, you recognize as being odd and treacherous and traitorous, say to yourself, he's probably a communist front, or the front of a communist front. He's operating against the interests of Canada, North America, the free world. You're entitled to say that in the privacy of your own mind and to be on guard and to say it to your most trusted friends as I'm saying it to you now. And we can all rest confident in the one recognition of recent history. For 60 years, the South African Communist Party have imagined that the day would come when they would give South Africa the final heave-ho. Just as they had the hammer and sickle flying on the town halls of Johannesburg and Cape Town in 1922, 1 year after they came to power. South African revolution nearly took place then. They thought that only a few more battles. At that time, it was a great big miners' strike of Witwatersrand. They only had to give one more push and they would have the communist empire established in South Africa then, and with it, the whole of the free world would go down. That was back in 1922. And communist leaders have come and gone since then in South Africa and in the free world. And in South Africa, I've told them, bear this in mind. Those communist leaders, each of them thought, as do the communist leaders now, like Bishop Tutu and Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela and the rest of them, that their great victory was just around the corner when they would see the flag flying over the whole of South Africa, and therefore the ultimate speedy decline and demise and revolution in the whole of the free world. But they are all united by one thing, those communist great leaders, those great communists of the South African history, the names like Olive Schreiner, T.J. Bain, Bill Andrews, Tom Matthews, Wilson Wilson, Solly Sachs, Izzy Diamond, the demon barber of Johannesburg, with his extraordinary Bolshevik clientele. They're all united by one thing. They all thought that they were going to see victory in that time, and they're all dead now. They're all in paradise up above, except for one man, David Ivor Jones, the communist leader, who is buried in the Kremlin wall in Moscow, from which there is no escape. They're all dead. They all thought that they were going to see it, and none of them did. And so I say that same great hope should inspire us all, provided we stand firm and we are not betrayed from within the way that the Americans were betrayed from within during their Vietnam War. But provided we recognize the dangers and we stand firm and we tell the South Africans by whatever way we can, by letters to the editor, to the politicians, by talking it out loud the way I'm telling you now, provided we stand firm, I am convinced they will not see that day when the flag flies over the whole of the free world, when the whole of the free world goes down because of the stupid, short-sighted blunders of our time-serving politicians of today. I am convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that the time will come when every person in this room sees the decline and demise of the Soviet Union first.
Can you take a few questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, would like to commence with the questions and answers.
Yes, his question there.
Mr. Irving, surely in the world context it really doesn't matter what pinheads like Joe Clark and Brian Mulfoney do.
Yes.
But surely Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan and their staffs and their advisors must be aware of the importance of platinum and manganese and chrome.
It is, and this, why the question is, why aren't the world's leaders aware of the importance of platinum, chrome, manganese, and vanadium, and so on? Names mentioned like Mrs. Thatcher, Mulroney, and Clark. Well, the answer is this is the great puzzle, and the United States Senate had a special foreign relations committee investigating the growth of communist subversion in southern Africa in 1982, and this was one conclusion they came to, that it's one of the most baffling aspects of the whole of the operation, that although undoubtedly it operates and militates against the interests of the free world, none of the so-called media giants and the politicians, the statesmen, have yet recognized this and have recognized where the true interests of the Western world lie. And I myself can offer no solidly based conviction as to why our leaders are operating in the other way. It's rather as though they're hypnotized in some way, or perhaps because they're frightened of what their voters who have been hypnotized will say about them. Bobby Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, for example, he goes down to South Africa and he mouths off about the position of the blacks, the plight of the blacks in South Africa. All that the South African government has to do, in my view, is just show video film over their television system of the plight of the blacks in Edward Kennedy's own constituency in Boston, in the suburbs there. And I've seen them myself, and they lived there in far worse conditions than the blacks are living in Crossroads or in Soweto or in the black townships in South Africa. But the politicians don't have the courage to say that, and the newspapers certainly are not offering us a lead.
Or the Indians in Canada.
Or the Indians in Canada is another example. I mean, how can you talk about apartheid in this country when you have situations which are absolutely 100% parallel of the apartheid system in South Africa, which of course is not to be construed as a criticism by me of your reserve system here in this country. Yes.
I'd read that the Enigma machine was kept under wraps with the bombing raid of Coventry.
Well, the Enigma machine. The question is, was the Enigma machine kept secret until the bombing raid of the Germans on Coventry in November 1940? There are two controversies here. The first controversy is, yes, we were reading the German Air Force signals, the operational signals from May 1940 onwards, and so we did know in enough time that Coventry was the target of the night of November the 14th, 1940. We knew it by that afternoon, in fact. There's also a Coventry within a controversy because, in fact, I have discovered from my own reading of the British files and from my possession of Churchill's diary, this diary which I've rented, the fact that on that afternoon Churchill believed that the target was going to be London. He was so told by the Air Ministry, who told him that they expected to know by 4 o'clock that afternoon the true target, but they believed the target to be London. And Churchill, as usual, whenever London was expecting an air raid, jumped into his car in the back garden gate of number 10 Downing Street and fled for the country. He fled for a little hidey hole he had in Oxfordshire, where he always spent the night when air raids took place on London. And it was only as his car was passing Hyde Park that he was overtaken by the news from the Air Ministry that the German blind bombing beams had now been switched on, and they intersected over Coventry, not over London, whereupon Churchill ordered the driver to turn back to number 10 Downing Street, where he arrived at 5 o'clock that evening. His staff were very astonished that he had come back, and he explained to his staff, waving the envelope at the piece of information he had received from the Air Ministry. He didn't tell them exactly what it said. He said, "I have just received this most doleful piece of information from the Air Ministry that there is to be a savage and barbarous Nazi air raid tonight on London," which was a complete lie, because he'd been told it was the opposite. It was going to be on Coventry. So he said there's going to be a Nazi air raid on London, and it would not be right if the citizens of this metropolis were to gain the impression that I was unwilling to take the medicine that is being meted out to them night after night by the Nazi barbarians. So I have come back. And that night he actually went onto the roof at 8 o'clock that night, onto the roof of his house, to await the oncoming Nazi bombers, like this. This is in the private diaries of his staff, his secretaries, and it's only when we know what the actual Air Ministry message said, which was at 4 o'clock that afternoon, Prime Minister, all is clear, London is not the target, it's going to be Coventry, 300 miles to the north. That is why he turned back to London that day. And unfortunately, this is another aspect of the picture of Winston Churchill that people are going to find very unpalatable. And I can't apologize enough for this fact, because I know I'm destroying a lot of cherished illusions about Churchill, and a lot of Canadians have found this very difficult. And in Chilliwack, where I spoke, for example, one couple got up and walked out after about a half an hour of my talk because they just couldn't take it any longer. And I do respect that. I've got the utmost sympathy for that, because if you've been brought up for 40 years on a lie, it's very difficult to have to accept it in the autumn of your life.
So is the
Yes.
preserving, excuse me, Mr. Irving, is the preserving of the Enigma secrecy, is that a cover-up for what happened?
Well, the Enigma machine was kept secret until 1974, and that is the fact that we were reading the German machine codes. Obviously, if it turns out that we were reading the German machine codes, this makes Field Marshal Montgomery's efforts all that much less important in the desert. It makes it plain how we managed to defeat the Germans. In fact, it raises the enormous question, how did the Germans manage to fight on for 6 years when we were reading all their signals? In other words, it rather detracts from the level of the Allied victory when you see that.